Ich möchte sehr, sehr herzlich im Namen der Wiener Volkshochschulen begrüßen Brigitte Aulenbacher und Michael Burawoy. We are very pleased to have you here. Thank you for joining us tonight. Und diese Veranstaltung dreht sich um Globalisierung und internationale Arbeitskämpfe, wie Sie aus dem Titel selbstverständlich wissen, und ist eine der Veranstaltungen in unserer Reihe Die Zukunft von Arbeit und Wohlstand.
I think it's really important if we're going to talk about transnational workers' struggles that we know something about the working class and we understand the experience of the working class. And that is what I'm going to talk about today. A number of studies that I have done over the last, I guess, almost 50 years. I'm going to talk about the experience of production. I was today, as Andrea said, I was today in the Karl Marx Hof, and that was the most extraordinary experience for me to see this social housing from the 1920s. It's particularly interesting for me because I come from the United States. Social housing is just not a part of the political vocabulary in the United States. We haven't had social housing for the last 40 years, and it's completely a non-possibility in the political discourse of the time, prior to Trump. It just was very inspiring to see how alive and well social housing here is here in Vienna. It actually is interesting we are here. You know, this place was a place where workers would come and listen to professors, as I understand it. Well, I do my work rather differently. I'm a professor and go and listen to workers in their workplace. So it's the reverse move. And so I spent much of my life actually working in workplaces around the world, and it's not been a very pleasant experience usually. I don't know how many people here have worked in industrial workplaces, but I'm a sort of middle-class bourgeois, petit bourgeois intellectual who finds it rather difficult to adapt to blue-collar work, and it's been rather a humiliating, often a humiliating experience trying to work in these different workplaces. In fact, what is very interesting is the way that workers respond to me as an incompetent worker. They respond very differently in Chicago, in Russia, in Hungary. I got a job. I didn't tell him why I was doing this, so I became basically what we call a spy. Or sometimes we call this more technically covert participant observation. Not overt, covert. So you do not tell the people you are studying that they are being studied. Quite impossible today with all these institutional review bodies. But it was the only way you could study what these multinational corporations from the top were doing. One thing I learned in Zambia was very interesting, that these multinational corporations, how did they act? I thought they would have a plan to deal with post-colonial Zambia. No. They lick their finger in the morning and see which way the wind is blowing, and then they make decisions. They do not plan. You don't plan in a very uncertain environment where the price of copper is fluctuating, where technology is uncertain, and where there's also political uncertainty. To have a plan in those circumstances is really asking for trouble. You have to be very, as they say today, flexible. So that's where flexible specialization comes from. Because what is happening, which I did not recognize at the time, is that we are seeing over the period 70s, 80s, 90s, is the rise of what we now call neoliberalism, what I call third wave marketization. And this actually is a devastating process for so many countries all over the world, but particularly countries in Africa, particularly countries that are dependent upon natural resources. And we see the development of precarious labor already beginning in the 80s and 90s. And the country as a whole becomes a very different country, much more destitute than when I was there.
That we are, since the middle of the 70s, are witnessing a third wave marketization, a new wave of market-driven accumulation and marketization of different sectors in our society. Different sectors means not only the sector of production, but also other sectors like healthcare, like school education, like the universities. What I know is one of the interest of Michael's research too. And we are witnessing a wave of marketization which goes through and through to the organization of labor in all these sectors, as well to the through the everyday life experience of people working in these different sectors, and to the everyday life experience in a sense of work-life balance, or as well as in experiencing a declining welfare state, the reconfiguration of the welfare state from welfare to workfare, with different policies of activating, we call that Aktivierungsstaat in German, where we have different policies, human capital-oriented social investment policies, and a declining welfare state all around. Capitalism is not able to offer us a good life for all. It's able to offer a good life for a minority of the population, but not a good life for all. And therefore I think we have to think about both, about precarity, about social inequality, inequalities. We have to recognize and to look for new polarizations inside of societies, between societies. If we are looking on the situation in Europe, especially in East and West European countries, especially in North and South European countries, we all know the case of Greece. So I think we have to discuss about both this new form of marketization, about precarity, precarious work, precarious life, about poverty and inequalities, as well as about social justice and solidarity as a moment in history of labor, as well as in the discussion about the future of labor.
About the importance of social justice and solidarity. I mean, the place where that, to my mind, in my experiences, was most clear was, perhaps paradoxically, in state socialist societies. So in Hungary, my Hungarian experience led me to see workers struggling, as I said before, struggling against the party state, but in the name of socialism. And so there was a real sense that the ideology, in this sort of perverse way, had actually affected the way that the working class saw its situation. It's most emphatically clear, I suppose, in the Solidarity movement, but there have been other movements, 1956 in Hungary, 1953 in East Germany, and indeed, you might say some of the mines, which I didn't talk about, but when I was up there in northern Russia, I was also spending time with the mine workers of Vorkuta, and they had a very radical vision in 1989 and then 1991, early 91, a very radical vision of the dissolution of the party state and the creation of an anarchistic socialism. They thought that would be based upon markets, but their whole 20-point plan was really a vision that they thought was a vision of social justice, and it was a vision of solidarity. And indeed, the mine workers across the Soviet Union, whether in the Ukraine or in Siberia, as well as in the north, they did form a very effective joint campaign against the party state. They were essentially the dynamite that brought down the Soviet Union. Deindustrialization in one place, it means industrialization in another place. And if Beverly Silver were here, then she would be obviously talking about that. But you know, if you look at actually industrialization and actually deindustrialization in the global south, if you look at places like the steel industry in countries, you know, whether it be Kazakhstan or whether it be India, or even Latin America, what you see is the development of what had been a labour aristocracy like the mine workers in the copper industry, the dissolution of that labour aristocracy, or its contraction, and it's been threatened by the development of outsourced working, subcontracted workers of a very precarious character. And as the labour aristocracy sort of shrinks, it becomes more defensive and more conservative. So you lose the struggles that often these labour aristocracies engaged in previous eras. So I think even yes, there is industrialization elsewhere, but that industrialization is itself undergoing changes which lead to increasing precarity. You know, in the United States, some of the most successful unions have been the ones that have taken struggles out of production and into the sphere of consumption, the public sphere. So the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, has made its name through the public humiliation of corporations for their atrocious labor relations. Then there is, at the moment in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries too, the struggles for minimum wage. These are struggles that trade unions participate in at the local political level. So it seems to me that trade unions, one strategy that trade unions can develop is actually to move out of production and to move into some sort of alliance with community struggles. As we know from what little we know about the support that Trump has received, it has received it, you know, unexpectedly in these so-called Rust Belt states, where in fact the working class has been dispossessed of jobs. When you're dispossessed of jobs, when you have no sort of guarantees if you lose a job, where unemployment compensation is very low, you want to protect your jobs. And in forming a trade union and using a trade union to struggle against capital, you are, in the eyes of many workers, endangering your job. If, in fact, there was a unionization that spread across the country, or industrial unionism that spread, then perhaps they would feel more secure to organize a union. But they don't, because what is the percentage now? 7% of private sector workers are unionized in the United States.
We have to defend the welfare state because all welfare states we know are declining, and precarity is the result of the declining of the welfare state too. But I think we do not only have to defend the welfare state, we have to reconfigure the welfare state. We have to develop a new vision of the welfare state. So there's nothing wrong in general or at all with social investment, but everything is wrong with a social investment which is only human capital oriented. If the welfare state invests only in children to educate the next generation of human capital, of workforce, then there's anything wrong with. We have to reconfigure the welfare state in the sense of the welfare state has to defend the conditions of life, has to work with concepts of redistribution, with concepts of solidarity and justice, and the welfare state should be provide the well-being for all, the good life for all, and not be driven in the direction of social investment only serving interests of capital. Indeed, we have a transnationalization of labor and politics, and indeed we have the situation that capital is international, and we have national frames of protest movements, national frames of trade unionist struggles and so on. But I see that there is a growing international solidarity too. But it's a very difficult situation we find in different movements between national interest and transnational activities. Domestic work is a wonderful example for such a situation. In domestic work, we have a lot of protest movements for more than 2 decades, international protest movements, and very successful protest movements, reaching petitions in the UN, reaching different forms of regulation by the International Labour Organization and so on. We have a lot of international, transnational protest movements, but we have a lot of national interests or national forms of competition or polarizations in society as well. And I think we have to talk about both. How we can think protest more transnationally, more international, how we combine the local interests and the global perspectives, how we can work with situations. There's a lot of interests or of forms of precarity, of injustice are local experiences, and we have nevertheless to look for global inequalities, for the global consequences of local interests of local formations and otherwise around. So the challenge will be to combine the global and the local, I think, the national, the transnational movements, the local and the international protest movements and so on. And I see that in the care sector, by example, we have a lot of protest that is organized transnationally and internationally.
2011 is only 5 years ago. So what happened in 2011? We had the Arab Spring, we had Indignados, we had the Occupy movement, we had movements of working class actually across Latin America, we had student movements. They were not production centered. They were, in my view, in some ways responding to precarity, if you will, but processes of marketization. So, and we now have movements, new political subjects of the right. So I don't think there is a shortage of political subjects. It's a matter of what those political subjects are going to actually deliver and the way and the consequences of their mobilization and their interconnection. That's the work that I think that we have to do, engage in.
Die Wiener Volkshochschulen veranstalten solche gesellschaftspolitischen Veranstaltungsreihen, um einfach ihrem Bildungsauftrag nachzukommen. Das heißt, neben dem, dass wir Kurse anbieten für unterschiedliche Bereiche, sehen wir auch gerade politische Veranstaltungen, die bestimmte aktuelle Themen thematisieren, in dem Fall die Zukunft der Arbeit, die Zukunft unseres Wohlstandes und der Gesellschaft, die das zusammenhält. Indem wir das thematisieren, kommen wir auch dem Bildungsauftrag nahe, weil nicht nur sozusagen ein Kurs oder Bildung im engsten Sinne die Menschheit stärkt oder auch gerade die Wienerinnen stärkt, sondern auch der Diskurs, die Debatte, Fragen zu stellen oder sich über tägliche politische Themen den Kopf zu zerbrechen gemeinsam. Unser Ziel ist es, mit diesen gesellschaftspolitischen Veranstaltungsreihen einfach Menschen aufzurütteln. Dahingehend aufzurütteln, wie die Verhältnisse sind, was es bedeutet, als arbeitender Mensch von dem Gehalt leben zu müssen, das man bekommt. Was bedeutet das, wenn die Löhne sinken? Was bedeutet das, wenn Menschen sozusagen nur mehr in bestimmten Sparten ausgebildet werden, weil das Humankapital gebraucht wird? Das sind Dinge, wo wir einfach zum Hinterfragen anregen möchten. Wir möchten aber auch, wie in unseren Kursen wir es einfach oft vorfinden, die soziale Ungleichheit ansprechen. In der Gesellschaft öffnet sich die Schere gerade in den Einkommensbereichen weiter auf. Wir spüren das in unseren Kursen. Wir sehen die Menschen, wie sie stärker unter Druck sind aufgrund von Arbeitslosigkeit, aufgrund davon, dass sie schneller wieder in Arbeit kommen müssen und keine Möglichkeiten haben, hier einfach sozusagen sich auch selbst mit Bildung zu stärken, sondern eher immer unter Druck sind, auch bestimmte Dinge für den Arbeitsmarkt abzuliefern. Das heißt, das ist auch für uns ein wichtiger Ansporn, die Verhältnisse zu hinterfragen, aber auch die Teilnehmenden daran zu ermuntern, die Verhältnisse aus ihrer eigenen und aus ihrer persönlichen Sicht zu hinterfragen. Denn Bildung ist nur dann wirksam, wenn es wirklich emanzipatorisch ist. Und emanzipatorisch heißt, dass man nicht irgendeine Flasche nimmt und da sozusagen in den Menschen hineinschüttet, sondern indem man Menschen anhält, dass sie selbst hinterfragen und auch selbst aktiv werden. Das ist eigentlich unser Ziel.
Was hat sich denn Ihrer Meinung nach in den letzten Jahrzehnten während der Globalisierung am Arbeitsmarkt verändert auf der Welt?
Also aus meiner Sicht hat sich sehr viel verändert. Zum einen haben wir es mit einer Deregulierung von Erwerbsarbeit zu tun. Also wir sind weit entfernt in vielen Branchen vom Normalarbeitsverhältnis. Zum Zweiten hat sich geändert, dass vormalige familiäre und Geschlechter- und Generationenarrangements nicht mehr stabil sind. Und das bedeutet eben auch eine Umschichtung von Versorgungsarbeit, Betreuungsarbeit in den Familien. Und das Dritte, was sich geändert hat, ist ein erheblicher Rückbau des Wohlfahrtsstaates. Das heißt, auch bisherige Formen sozialer Sicherheit sind nicht mehr ohne weiteres verfügbar. Alle drei Tendenzen zusammengenommen machen sich im Leben von Menschen alltäglich bemerkbar, die ihre Kräfte weit mehr anspannen müssen, um diese Anforderungen aus allen drei Richtungen, also für sich selbst und andere, zu sorgen, flexibler zu sein, mobiler zu sein, sich mit prekären Verhältnissen zu arrangieren, miteinander in ihr Leben zu integrieren. Und ich denke, dass da eine ganz andere Lebenserfahrung in den Generationen seit Mitte der 70er Jahre des letzten Jahrhunderts vorhanden ist als vorher.
Wie kann man jetzt solche Probleme lösen? Was können Gewerkschaften alles tun?
Ich glaube, dass eine ganze Reihe von Themen tatsächlich momentan brennen, obwohl es so scheint, als wären es einfach traditionelle Themen. Das Thema Arbeitszeit halte ich für ein zentrales Thema, weil Arbeitszeit natürlich dasjenige Thema ist, an dem Work-Life-Balance sich entzündet, und das halte ich für eines der Zentralthemen. Das zweite Thema, das ich für enorm wichtig halte, ist eine Diskussion über die Arbeits- und Lebensarrangements, die wir haben wollen. Das Adult-Worker-Modell beispielsweise, das als eine Richtgröße in der europäischen Sozialpolitik gilt, ignoriert vollkommen, dass Menschen Sorgepflichten haben. Und auch hier müssen wir zu einer ganz anderen Vorstellung von adäquaten Sorgen, von gutem Leben kommen. Dann halte ich eine neue sozialpolitische Diskussion für zentral. Im Moment ist es so, dass beispielsweise Bereiche von Altenpflege als Kostenfaktor in unserem Wohlfahrtsstaat erscheinen, während Bereiche der Kinderbetreuung als soziales Investment erscheinen, weil es um die Arbeitskräfte von morgen geht. Also auch hier halte ich eine neue Diskussion für dringend erforderlich. Da sind Gewerkschaften gefördert, aber da sind letztlich auch andere zivilgesellschaftliche Initiativen gefordert und auch am Werk.
Gilt da auch Schweden zum Beispiel jetzt als Vorbild mit der 6 Stunden, mit dem 6-Stunden-Arbeitstag?
Ich denke nach wie vor, dass Schweden vorbildlich ist, sowohl mit solchen Regelungen als auch mit einem nach wie vor weiter ausgebauten Wohlfahrtsstaat. Allerdings sehe ich mit einiger Sorge, dass auch der Wohlfahrtsstaat in Schweden Richtung Sozialinvestment geht. Also auch da ist eine ähnliche Entwicklung, allerdings nicht in so dramatischem Ausmaß zu beobachten. Allerdings nach wie vor in Schweden gilt, also es wird im Betreuungsangebote werden über Sachleistungen gemacht. Der öffentliche Sektor ist viel stärker in der Verantwortung und Arbeitsverhältnisse sind weitaus stärker reguliert, und dass solche Arbeitszeitinitiativen von dort kommen, halte ich nicht für zufällig. Und ja, das hat Vorbildcharakter nach wie vor.
What has changed during the last decades through globalization on the labor market?
Whoa, it's been in most countries a bit of a disaster. It has generated great uncertainty and precarity for many. There are elites that have managed to protect themselves from that, but for most people it has increased precariousness. Do you want me to say more?
For which people it has increased?
For example, we think of people in university, lecturers, faculty, they're usually thought of as having a protected position as part and parcel of the way that they work, that they have to have some security, otherwise they can't think independently. But increasingly across the world, faculty are in an ever more precarious position, and there are ever fewer who are in a secure or tenured position. And it's true here in Austria, and it's true in Germany, it's true in the United States, in different ways. But so that's an example of an occupation or an institution that before was very stable, but is now much less so.
What can the US and what can Europe learn from the different labor markets?
You're in labor markets, okay. Different labor markets. Well, it's a matter of how one can reverse precaritization, and there have been various proposals, such as, for example, the basic income grant is something that has been quite popular in Europe. So guarantee people a sort of minimal level of existence, and so that they don't have to work. So capitalists then have to actually seduce them to work. It will change the character of the way we run the world. So if there were struggles for basic income grants or universal basic income grants, that would change. The old ways have been, of course, through struggles of trade unions, and historically they have produced wonderful things like the welfare state, or helped to produce them. But trade unions are becoming ever weaker as they face ever greater surpluses of population, and as capital is ever more mobile. So the situation of workers is much more defensive, so they find it much more difficult to struggle for gains. Yeah.
What can trade unions do all over the world to stick more together?
To stick more together? It's very difficult for trade unions to stick together because they are organized, usually industry, then nationally. It's very difficult for them to build solidarity. I think trade unions have to actually, first of all, think about how they can become stronger. And they can become stronger if they think about actually organizing not just in production, but in organizing outside production. So if they begin to struggle for increases in the minimum wage, which is established politically rather than economically. So they have to move into the areas of consumption, into the public sphere. They have to move out of production.